Hello, everyone. Please feel free to put your name and your affiliation where you're joining from in the chat. And I guess we will get started. My name is Kristen Reynolds. I'm the chair of the Food Studies program and director of the Food and Social Justice Action Research Lab at the New School, and co-editor with Jose Luis Chicoma of this report that we're basing the webinar on, the elephant at the table. So this virtual webinar series about the report explores how power inequities in food systems undermine the sustainability of food. Food systems are shaped by power: who controls resources, who sets the rules, and whose interests are protected. But when power is ignored, efforts to improve food system sustainability remain marginal. So in this series, we examine how meaningful food systems transformation depends on confronting power directly. This series draws on a year-long collaboration led by Jose Luis Chicoma while in residency as program chair for this project at the New Institute in Hamburg, Germany. So the collaboration over that year involved 8 scholars and practitioners who developed food policy recommendations to confront power across sectors of the food system, including agroecology, fisheries, affordable diets, governance, and today's topic, seeds. The series that we're running for the webinar covers those 8 topics. Today's focus is seeds and a chapter entitled Farmers First: Reclaiming Food Sovereignty for Biodiverse Value Chains. The series is hosted by Food and Planet, the Food and Social Justice Action Research Lab at the New School, and the New Institute. Today's session is co-hosted by Crops for the Future and the International Crops Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics, all of whom are doing critical work in food systems in their own right. Thanks to the events and communications staff, the IT staff, and Cedric Gottfried, who's PhD candidate at the New School, for their assistance in helping to run this webinar. So next slide, please. I'd like to introduce today's speakers. So today's presenters are Saeed Azam Ali, who's the founding CEO in 2011 of Crops for the Future Research Center in Malaysia, and CEO since 2022 of Crops for the Future in the UK. In 2026, he was elected as chair of the UN High-Level Panel of Experts on Food Security and Nutrition. He'll present today on the power inequities related to seeds, sovereignty, and biodiversity. Following Saeed, we'll have 2 commentators. Sean Mays is an associate professor in crop genetics at the University of Nottingham in the UK. He has led work on genetic improvement at the Crops for the Future Research Center and more recently at the International Center for Research in the Semi-Arid Tropics. Manzoor Dar, who currently serves as the global head of seed systems and delivery research at the International Crops Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics, is joining us as well. Prior to this current position, he led the global research cluster on seed systems and germplasm evaluation at IRRI. During the session today, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to address them after the formal comments during the Q&A portion. A reminder that the session is being recorded, and we will be sharing it at a YouTube link at a later date. So I will now pass it over to Saeed for the presentation.
Thanks, Christine, and thank you to all of you for coming to this talk. Yes, it's about seed systems, but I wanted to set a context for it because, of course, we're in yet another crisis which impinges on all of us, but it's primarily the current crisis is one of a series. So really, I want to set the scene by saying we've been warned. This is not the first crisis that we're going to face, and it's certainly not the last. Let's go back to COVID. We all know about it, but between 13 and 18 million people have died already or as a result of COVID. But apart from age, the biggest comorbidity factors are bad diet related, hypertension, diabetes, and of course, obesity. So bad diets have been very closely linked with the COVID pandemic. This picture you can see here is of the Ever Given, a ship that blocked the Suez Canal for just 6 days. And as a consequence, $36 billion worth of trade, including foodstuffs, was stopped because this very narrow waterway, 293 meters wide, plus the Straits of Malacca between them, account for, or shipping lanes account for 90% of world trade. And anything that blocks these very narrow shipping lanes, the consequence, of course, affects us all. And of course, the Ukraine war, and again, we're aware of the Ukraine war and its ongoing consequences, but primarily its biggest impact for people outside the conflict region has been on food supplies, because the Ukraine region, Black Sea region, accounts for 29% of globally traded wheat, 28% of barley, 15% of maize, 75% of sunflower. And whilst we perhaps didn't even know where Ukraine was before the conflict, we do now realize the consequences of the supply chains and supply distribution consequences of that conflict. And sometimes we're even accused of self-harm, because in Brexit, we chose deliberately to disconnect Britain from 27 of its nearest trading partners. And of course, the consequences have been the supply and distribution of food in our supermarkets. So all of this leads to where we are now, which is not just a consequence of supply chains for food, which all of those were primarily, but supply chains for fossil fuels and fertilizers because of the blockage of the Strait of Hormuz. So what I'm really pointing to is these are the amplitude, frequency, and consequences of these crises is only going to get greater. And therefore, the context for where we're talking about seed systems is very much around the food system that we now have. And if we look at that food system, I presented this as a pyramid, but at the top you can see 4 crops. And those are the 4 crops that are primarily the staple foods that feed us. More than 60% of the calories produced for the human diet, 8 billion people, comes from just 4 crops: wheat, rice, maize, and soy. And if we add the other next section, 60 crops that are part of the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, that gives us just 64 crops on which we depend that are considered major crops. Now, we can say, well, these are 4 crops and they produce the food that we eat, but of course, they do much more than that. They suck up the investment, the subsidies, the research, the products, the technologies, and of course, the breeding effort that we actually spend on these crops, not to mention legislation, certification, seed banks, policies, advocacy, trade, marketing. All of those things are based around these primary staple crops. And the consequence of that is these 7,000 so-called underutilized, minor, orphan, forgotten, now more recently called opportunity crops, attract very little of this investment. They're generally marginalized, stigmatized, rejected, or just actually ignored in terms of investment and all those characteristics you've seen around the major 4 crops. So it's not just 4 crops that feed us, but everything points around those 4 crops to the structure, and therefore the consequences of anything that affects one of those 4 crops has global significance. How did we get here? And why are we in the condition and the state that we're in? And for how long has this transition occurred? Well, only about 70 years, since the 1950s. And if we actually look at the change since the 1950s, the whole system of corporatization, capitalization, consolidation, we can look at breeding and research and investment, all those characteristics I've mentioned. But in fact, in the 1950s, policies, investment, and research focused on maximizing the yield of these few commercially bred crops. And formal plant breeding, of course, developed these high-yielding varieties of these of primarily wheat, rice, and maize. So that was the focus of policies and investments since the 1950s. The well-known Green Revolution has led to a very few genetically uniform staple crops grown as industrial monocultures, largely for export from regions which could produce these crops to countries and regions which depend on their products for their own food security. And in the 1980s, genetic manipulation and new traits which were introduced through genome editing, tools that allow genetic changes to be made very quickly and precisely, more precisely than traditional methods, were, of course, again focused on desirable traits in just these few crops. And then climate finance more recently has been directed to the adaptation of these mainstream staples to climate change rather than to the crops that have historically been resilient and able to survive despite the lack of investment and support for them. If we just take legislation and enforcement, we can see here the intellectual property sequence from the 1960s. Plant breeders' rights, European seed companies secured plant breeders' rights through the creation of the Convention on the International Union for the Protection of New Varieties of Plants, UPOV. In the 70s, the US Plant Variety Protection Act allowed 17-year plant variety protection certificates that excludes others from reproducing the same variety for commercial sale. In 1985, the US utility patent system emerged after a Supreme Court decision to extend patent law to genetically modified organisms, meaning that plant genetic resources could be owned by individuals or institutions, and therefore the idea that intellectual property could be extended, as in 1985, the patent system extended to living organisms, intellectual property over nature. And the principle of that was embedded in the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, TRIPS, and the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, which define intellectual property rights over plant genetic resources as trade-related issues. Both TRIPS and GATT are embedded in the rules of the World Trade Organization, and therefore now seeds can be owned as commercial products. Control over their use shifts, therefore, from farmers, historically in local communities, towards global markets and seed corporations. And that's all in the last 70, 75 years that this enormous consolidation has occurred around the seed systems that were historically the property of everybody in terms of a global public good. Now, if we look at the consequences of that, what happened when we had this consolidation and legislative infrastructure that was established in the last few decades? Farmers have lost their rights to save, use, and exchange seeds, even their own seeds. And the requirement, the DUS requirement of distinct, uniform, and stable characteristics for varieties marginalizes their traditional varieties and land races. Standardization of seed quality and safety requirements, again, restricts local and traditional seed systems. So in all of that, we see a power asymmetry from farmers in the ability to actually grow and trade and exchange their own seeds to corporations and companies that now focus on the sale of those seeds. At the same time, we saw the Green Revolution develop a yield for profit, or I should really say calories for profit, because primarily the production of these crops was to produce calorific ingredients into food systems. But that paradigm has not just driven the yield for profit characteristic, but of course it's developed, it's been the factor that's driven investors and development banks and NGOs and even philanthrocapitalists that have encouraged this feed the world narrative around a yield for profit paradigm. Consequence for public research has been that it's increasingly, first of all, public research has been diminished in terms of investment. Public support for research and breeding has declined. And in that, we see commercially driven technologies for corporate interests funding research. And that is in itself a contradiction, really, because public research should be for public good and for global public good, or curiosity even. But it's indeed now increasingly required for us as researchers to seek funding from commercial sources. And that means that corporate interests determine what research is done and for whom the benefits accrue. Now, in all of that, these 7,000 crops, and I say 7,000 because that's the number of crops over our life, over the history of farming to 12,000 years. We've been breeding improvement, knowledge, practices, all these characteristics that we've uh, built over these millennia on underutilized crops have been marginalized and disregarded or even stigmatized. So how do we move from that to a vision for a biodiverse value chains and reclaiming seed sovereignty? And in this seed sovereignty, we're talking about the right of farmers to save, use, exchange, and sell their own seeds. And in that, to actually achieve seed sovereignty for biodiverse value chains, we need to build a whole series of characteristics that allow us to address this issue. And I've just listed some of those here. And in the chapter, we go into more detail in terms of what are the characteristics that we need to actually achieve this objective of seed sovereignty for biodiverse value chains. We need to embed seed sovereignty within rights to food or the right to food and land legislation. The right to food should be really expressed as a characteristic in policies that ensure seed sovereignty and secure land access for smallholder farmers and their communities. So we really have to see that the right to food should be something that is embedded in national and international policy frameworks, into global legislation, and allow farmers autonomy and protection from corporate control and commercialization. We need to facilitate market access for farmers and producers not just for biodiverse products, but of course for biodiverse seed systems that could feed and support the products that the market can demand. We need to provide policies and incentives for farmers in the private sector to produce biodiverse foods. The domination of the global food supply chain by corporate players discourages competition between producers and diversification amongst farmers. Incentivizing the production or more biodiverse foods requires policies, regulations, financial measures, strategies to stimulate their production, their marketing, their consumption, and of course their affordability. And we need farmer-led research and knowledge networks. I mean, in this context, who are the experts on underutilized crops and the crops that have been ignored by people like us as academics and researchers? That knowledge has been retained by communities for millennia, and they are the experts in their own environments of their own crops. So we need to look at how farmer research networks can be actually supported by knowledge and digital infrastructure and data and information systems that actually allow them to make wise decisions that are best suited to their own circumstances. We mentioned community seed exchange. Of course, that's the right to exchange seed that farmers now would have if they had seed sovereignty. But not just seed exchange, but actually using seed exchange as a means of connecting not just the physical exchange of seeds, but the scientific and social capital that comes with them. And that means educating, exchanging information on history, on objectives, on crop types, on scale, on size, on type, on density of seed networks, all linked around the exchange of seeds. So the knowledge systems that come with it. And then policies that we can see that incentivize biodiverse seed systems so that we can actually support the seed systems that we're actually advocating through enabling policies and legislation. So these are some of the ideas that we really develop in the chapter, and the idea of a vision for 2050 that's based around seed sovereignty and biodiverse value chains. Why is that possible, and why does that all sound very ambitious and perhaps unrealistic? But if we actually look at the opportunities we now see for this vision, first of all, we can see a climate crisis, nutrition deficit, geopolitical risks that I've introduced right at the beginning of the talk. Mainstream staples, are they going to be enough to achieve food security for 10 billion people by 2050 if we continue with business as usual. If we can't, then we must look at alternatives. If we take UPOV, does it regulate all the major crops? Yes, but not their varieties necessarily. But of course, most crop species are not covered by UPOV, and all other edible plants are not covered by UPOV. Farmer movements, indigenous people, rural communities, and now, if you like, conventional farmers now seek to have greater agency over their activities and sovereignty over their seeds. And therefore, there's a growing global movement towards farmer sovereignty and therefore seed sovereignty. And very recently, I think, but certainly I've recognized the change in that crop diversity has now gained the interest of decision makers and sponsors. And throughout my career, it's always been a nice thing to think about, but no one was really interested in supporting. But now we know and we recognize diverse systems, both in terms of crops and in cropping systems, are more resilient to environmental and economic stresses. And in that context, we can see decision makers, policy makers, investors are looking again at the idea that diversity is not an inconvenience, is actually something which allows us to provide more resilient, sustainable food systems. All of this requires farmers to be at the center of biodiverse systems. So we really have to build a system in which farmers are at the center rather at the end of the chain. I'm not going to take you through all of this, but I just wanted to list how we're going to deliver this. We have to look at how farmers' rights to save, use, and exchange seeds can be achieved by removing the restrictions of plant breeders' rights and UPOV restrictions. We have to break the consolidated corporate interest in the seed market by investing in collaborative plant breeding, and I'll come back to that in my last slide. And we have to switch from this green revolution paradigm to look at diverse purposes from crops and diverse. We have to change the culture of development banks and NGOs to look at alternatives to the green revolution paradigm. And of course, indigenous knowledge is implicit in diversification because farmer-led research and knowledge systems will be based on the knowledge that they have greater than us in terms of their own crops and their own cropping systems. We've got to reinvest in public research for global public good, and that includes environmental protection rather than simply yield. And we've got to really take research beyond all these advanced new technologies to allow farmers and build farmer innovation and capacities into the research system. Climate finance, well, we really have to look at farmer-led adaptation and mitigation rather than the sort of climate bonds that we're now addicted to in terms of finding ways to actually justify expenditure. And we've got to take the dismantle the yield for profit narrative to look at other values than yield, including resilience and nutrition and values that actually support community development. Now, in my last slide, I just want to give one example because I think this may be useful for Sean and Manzoor to actually reflect on, is how do we do this in terms of building farmers at the beginning and at the center of the breeding and selection process for seeds. And if you take the example on the left, formal plant breeding, we look at adaptability, adaptation, wide adaptation, and yield uniformity over years as our main criteria. So we look at that as the driving gradient before we actually see farmers receiving and being able to use seeds. If we look at collaborative plant breeding, we bring local knowledge in at the beginning so that farmers are actually involved in the selection of new varieties, the multiple end uses rather than simply or only yield, and the idea that they are part of the co-creation and co-innovation in the development of varieties that are suited to their own circumstances. So really what we're seeing is farmers at the beginning rather at the end of the value chain of plant breeding, and we bring them in so that seed sovereignty, farmer sovereignty and local knowledge are included in the technologies that we can bring for their for the improvement of their crops and for wider wider use of crop diversity. So really, that's what I wanted to set the agenda for, certainly for Sean and Manzura to comment on, and I'll be very interested to hear from all of you in terms of your reflections on that. But really, what we've got to look for is a way forward that is different from continuing with our business as usual, which really is not going to be suitable for the future. Thank you. Back to you, Kristin.
Thank you very much, Saeed. And you can, if you want to stop sharing your slides, then they won't appear for everyone. This is so important when we recognize, as I'm sure we all do, the very swift geopolitical changes that are taking place kind of every day. And recognize, observe, imagine how marginalized farmers, ethnically marginalized farmers, women farmers are likely to bear the brunt of some of the negative ends of this. And as we see technology, AI, increasing evolutions in genetic engineering and gene editing, all of this is so relevant to thinking about what we're seeing from a day-to-day basis and imagining how this will shape seeds and seed sovereignty in the future. So now I want to pass it over to our first commentator to make about 5 minutes of comment, and that is Sean Mays.
Thank you, Kristin, and thank you also, Saeed, for the coverage of the subject. I think you identify a lot of important points there, particularly in terms of the power structures and particularly in terms of the way that things have developed over the last 70, 80 years. I think one of the things I'm a geneticist, so I come at it from a slightly different direction, if you like, from a how do you do things direction to some extent. And I think while there are lots of challenges at the moment, I think there are a lot of opportunities as well. And in a sense, climate change is an opportunity. I mean, it's not a good one. It'd be better if we weren't worrying about it. But I think it really is forcing the issue of diversity within cropping systems and within crops. And I think it's quite clear that the major crops, particularly major cereals, will struggle to work in all of the environments we're currently working in and will have lower yields in many cases. And I think that really helps drive the question of diversification because diversification gives you resilience within a system. And I think most of the things that are needed for that are already present. So many of the original farmer land races from a wide range of crops are collected within gene banks, and they basically just maintain that diversity as a source for future breeding. And I think that in that case, that's governed by a whole series of different rules, but essentially a large part of that is available to people. So there is potentially material to be working from. Um, Overall, I think the key thing at the moment has to be how to make agriculture sustainable. And a lot of the crops that we use, the major crops, are bred for high intensity. They're bred for green revolution, to have everything given to them to give us higher yield as possible. And in many areas in the world, and particularly in the drylands where 2.1 billion people live, that system by itself doesn't really always work terribly well, and it certainly doesn't work in some cases sustainably. So there clearly is a need for an additional component. I mean, I wouldn't argue in any sense that whenever we're going to get away from rice and wheat and maize, because I don't think we are, and I don't think we should be trying to. I think what we need to be doing is really trying to put agriculture into a local context in terms of what gets grown so that that can be grown sustainably. And that as well, it has a focus towards nutrition, which I think is one of the things that the major crops have lost. Um, how do we do that? Well, I think one of the problems in many ways is in terms of what is the demand for these underutilized crops? And I think that's to some extent where a lot of the bottleneck sits. Is it's perfectly possible to do research on these crops. I mean, obviously at a low level because of the amount of money available. It's possible to show they work. It's possible to show that the Bambara groundnut, which is one of the ones we've worked on, is a perfectly good crop and would be very, very useful and is preferred in many cases. But the whole value chain isn't there and the demand isn't there. And I think that's one of the things that we have to start thinking about in terms of how to diversify agriculture. It has to be diversified coming from the demand side in the end. Local farmers, that's farmers who work either on subsistence or small income, will grow these crops because they're reliable. They're reliable and they'll work when other crops don't. But in terms of getting the investment that's needed, it's much more difficult. Um, and that's really one of the areas where I think the food industry, both big and small, really needs to be working with everybody else in terms of bringing forward these opportunities to produce crops which are resilient but also are much less environmentally damaging. Um, in terms of the various different aspects, I think one of the things that we do probably need to be a bit careful about from what's been raised is conflating too much of the different subjects. So plant breeding as it exists today is an expensive business. It's an intensive business. Significant progress is being made using genetics and using DNA markers. And it is making good progress, but the problem is it's limited to relatively small numbers of crops. Seed systems is a slightly different in a sense. You go through the process of breeding and you register a variety. And I think as scientists have said about, one of the problems with that is that most registration systems at the moment require a new variety to be distinct, uniform, and stable. And that effectively means uniform, and in many cases, that's monoculture. Um, what that does, and in a sense, it's a sensible thing to do, is it means you grow it in different environments, and those different environments tell you how reliable it is. So effectively, what's being sold to farmers is reliable seed, and that reliable seed they can be fairly confident about. Where it doesn't work is where you really start looking at, okay, it's broadly adapted, so that's good, but it's not adapted to that local environment. So it could be you could get better yields or better results by having much more variation that's actually suited to different environments. And I think that's where farmers can really get involved because the situation is that the companies, or even if it's all done on public good, there's simply no way that enough people can look at that to be able to do it. And I think this is one of the areas where seed systems, if it's coupled with actually informing breeding, can start to actually provide essentially local varieties. So going back more towards a landrace, but an improved situation, but it's suited to that environment. And I think that's really quite important in terms of making sure that we get the best yields as well as nutrition that we possibly can without necessarily risking that nutritional element or the diversity element, which is needed for the resilience. And I think those are things that I think it's not simple. I mean, the proposal that sides put forward makes good sense, but it's a really significant shift. And I think we need to find a way to transition that because I don't think there's going to be a revolution in terms of how this works, because I don't think we can risk shifting from something that effectively works now to something that could work without quite knowing how we do the middle bit. So in that sense, I think moving to farmer cooperatives, I mean, that's a good example where you're bringing in lots of farmers to be involved in not only the production of seed, quality seed, but also in terms of actually producing the varieties themselves or the subsets of varieties. And I'm sure Manzor could say a lot more about some of the approaches being used. And I think it's that collective approach which is going to be important. At the moment, the companies will basically provide breeding and provide seed for situations where they think they can make a profit. And you know, that's not unreasonable that that's what they are, they're companies. So hybrid seed, for instance, where you can't reuse a seed is one case where you will get involvement from commercial companies. Inbred seed is less so because you farmers can reuse it. And it depends on the regulations in individual countries as to how that works. In the longer term, I think we're going to be moving more to using perennial cereals. because in some of the harshest environments, those are the things that will probably work. And there's even less incentive in that case. Um, so I think, yes, as a long-term objective, as a long-term framework, I think there's some really important points there. Um, and how do we get that back to farmers? I mean, we're involved in CFF through a buyer corporate social responsibility program in actually setting up some community-based breeding programs in a number of crops. And those are one model that potentially means that the community could end up owning effectively the varieties that come out. And I think that that's a model worth trying. But if you think about the scale at which this needs to work to make an impact, it's really very significant. And I think that's where the conundrum is how do you get not millions, but hundreds of millions of farmer groups involved, group of farmers involved in these groups. And not all of them will be breeders, but all of them can be involved in testing. And I think that really changes the mindset in how we bring these things forward. And I think that's probably all I want to say at this point. I mean, what I would strongly argue is we have to diversify, but when we diversify, I think it's an opportunity to also diversify the power structures as well. And I think it's important that we consider that because having five major uh, agricultural companies producing most of the seed for most of the big crops is probably sustainable, but it's not equitable, if you like. Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you very much, Sean, for that, bringing this all together and connecting it to the power analysis. I'm just going to pass it to Manzoor directly. We have about 5 to 7 minutes commentary. So Manzoor.
Thank you very much, Kristen. And thank you, Sean, and thank you, Said, for setting the tone. I think the presentation made by you was insightful and it clearly highlighted how the current, agri-food systems have evolved towards a uniform, concentrated approach. You rightly mentioned those four crops, top of the pyramid. So as a seed system specialist, I would build from there, and I think I will reflect on one key question, which is uh, what seed systems can where seed systems can step in to shape a solution for all those things. So seed systems in general have been traditionally viewed as narrowly working as a mechanism to produce seeds or deliver seeds to farmers. But I think it is beyond that. Seed systems sit at the intersection of biodiversity and conservation. It also, works on markets and value chains, policy and regulations, farmer knowledge and innovations. So when we talk about, narrowing this crop diversity and farmer marginalization, market concentration, we're fundamentally talking about how seed systems have been designed and also governed. Now, if we look at the points that you highlighted in your presentation, particularly on the research investments that has been focused on major crops and the policies and seed certification systems that have always favored uniformity, the intellectual property rights have strengthened control over seeds, and from seed systems perspective, this has led to the weakness of informal farmer managed seed systems. It has limited access of seeds of those traditional underutilized climate resilient crops. And importantly, the farmers' rights and agencies have been eroded. Now, this is not the challenge about which crops we use. This is also, about who controls the seeds and how diversity is maintained and how systems respond to local needs. Now, in the context of changing climate and in the context of the nutrition challenges, seed systems have even become more critical. Why? Because seed systems can determine how farmers can adapt to the climate change, what plants and crops they can use, how quickly the resilient crop varieties can reach to the farmers, whether diverse crops, are in the market and and also in the diets. Now, for example, if we want to disseminate a variety which is climate resilient and also has high nutritional value, unless we see seed systems multiply it at scale, deliver them at local level, and ensure that they are affordable and accessible to the farmers, this in this way there's been a lot of well intended innovations that have failed, not at the research level but at the level of seed systems and delivery. Now, the idea of seed sovereignty and biodiverse value chain, it resonates from the perspective of seed systems. How we can uh, you know how we can operationalize needs a strategy, and the strategy has to be moving from the linear uh, systems to decentralized system where we can have a combination of formal seed system which takes care of ensuring quality regulations, informal seed systems that ensures variability, uh, diversity, adaptability, and local relevance. At the same time, intermediate models like community-based seed banks. There's a lot of work that organizations are doing on developing local enterprises through seed banks, which takes care of bridging between both formal and informal seed system. Now, collaborative breeding is another, I think Sean briefly touched upon this, where farmers are not just the recipients of the innovation, they're also co-creators of the varieties, where, the preferences they have in terms of what they like, what do they want to consume, what is working good for the climate change, and those all are, incorporated in designing the products and varieties that suit to the real conditions. Now, if we look at the holistic approach, we talk about certain things that necessarily need to be embedded as a part of overall seed system that can contribute to moving away from a uniform system to a diverse climate resilient system. And I will start with with decentralized system. We in India and in South Asia, there's a large network of collectives, very organized collectives, both women and men, self-help groups for women and farmer producer companies. And they have become a very potential source for seed systems where local seed systems are developed, the capacity of in seed sector is developed, where they can use their own varieties. In many cases, farmers are still using land races and believe because of any reasons are doing better than the modern varieties. So, local production of those quality seeds for diverse crops through decentralized systems is going to be key to maintain the diversity of crops and varieties. Mainstreaming, under-nutritionized crops, and it's not only about conserving it. I think conservation part has been always there, but I think it is linking them with the modern seed system. In India, if I can quote an example about a policy alignment that has supported the land races of the crops which are underutilized to develop a seed system for them so that the seeds could be produced with quality, and they could be brought into the seed chain, and then there could be different classes of seeds produced, and to ensure that the farmers have access to the good quality seeds of these land races or the traditional varieties they want to use. So creating space for that farmers seeds have flexible certification. So there is an SOP that has been developed in one of the states in India. And I think this is going to be quickly adopted by others because there's a lot of, focus these days on how we not only can conserve these crops that are not being utilized properly, but can also mainstream them through policy alignments. So we need to also make sure that private sector at this point, as we know, are concentrated on four top crops and hybrids, particularly because of the business. But at the same time, I think there is an opportunity to develop public-private, farmer-led partnerships where we can engage partnership and leverage, some of the private sector work so that the, farmers can also be supported to become enterprises for the seeds that they locally, use and are adapted to. At the same time, capacity building is become very important in seed sector. Again, I would quote example of, it is more needed in Africa, but what we do in Asia is we're empowering farmers, especially women. You know, we've been discussing about why women, there's always a debate on role of women in seed sector. I think traditionally it's all believed that women are the real custodians of the seeds, and rightly so. And if you look at the way they take care of the seeds as compared to men, I have no, I'm saying this full confidence. So we're working with those groups led by women who are basically taking this forward in terms of producing seeds at local level, and we're helping them to become a sort of small enterprises at local level and link them with the formal seed sector for quality aspects so that the seed can be, it's also about livelihood. Seed sectors cannot be only used as preserving the land races or old varieties. It has to also become a source of livelihood for the farmers in those regions. So I think, building capacity in that sector, particularly women as seed producers, entrepreneurs, is something that needs to be, supported and strengthened. So if I look at overall, if we want to really transition from a uniform, vulnerable system to a very, a diverse, climate resilient and nutrition sensitive system, I think seed systems is not a component. It's going to be a central lever for transformation. So these are the comments that I wanted to make in the context of what Syed, said in his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manzoor. It's so helpful to hear all three of your perspectives build off of each other. Last week, we had a seminar on neglected and underutilized species led by Emma McDonald. And all of this really interweaves nicely. So I want to remind everyone, you can put your questions in the Q&A box. We have one on risk, and I want to just kind of preface this a little bit. So there are a lot of changes that are taking place right now. This is a question for the panel, right? That affect or could affect farmer seed sovereignty. For example, the European Parliament is set to cast its deciding vote on regulation, or what some movements would call deregulation, of gene-edited species. And so while the mainstream farmer unions have been in favor of this change, grassroots groups like La Via Campesina argue that this will take away from seed sovereignty and ecological biodiversity for farmers. So when we hear these narratives, and again, I'm connecting this to the questions about risk, that we have in the chat, one block of farmers is sometimes presented in the news as being a representative of all farmers. Obviously, this is not the case since farmers are diverse politically, socioeconomically, etc. So a question that bridges a few questions we have here is when we talk about farmer participation in policy, decision making, risk management, or participatory breeding, what, from your perspective, what kinds of farmers get to participate and represent farmers' needs, and how can we ensure that these don't existing power inequities in selecting farmer representatives, especially thinking about gender, as Manzoor focused on in his comments, given land inequities that respect to gender and other gender gaps in agriculture. So again, how do we ensure that we don't reinforce existing power inequities among farmers with respect to gender as we think about risk management, and participatory breeding? Would anybody like to jump in, or I can ask you specifically?
I think Sean and Manzoor are better qualified to, particularly on the farmer representation context.
I mean, I can say a little bit in terms of like things like gene editing. I mean, gene editing again is at the moment at least is quite an expensive technology, but it has a great deal of potential. So I can understand that some farmers are very much in favor because it could be used to make everything a lot more sustainable. It could deal with disease pressures, and it's got potential in terms of changing nutritional values. But equally, there's the argument that this is something that individual farmers, individual small farmers can't do. So it sort of comes back to some extent again to the idea of cooperatives, because I mean, it is a technology that would benefit lots of small farmers potentially. But they need to be involved from the beginning because there is a question of acceptability. And I think, it's same with the whole GMO issue. The fact that people weren't involving farmers early on and weren't really explaining, and it was coming from very large corporations, were all things that really mitigate against GMO being accepted. I think gene editing is different, and I think it would be shown to be different. But it's important that, again, farmers are involved early, and it depends on the country, depends on the context. So in Europe, it's a different set of farmers. In India, it will be a different set of farmers. But there needs to be the sort of educational side of it so people can understand and then can be involved.
Thanks. Would anybody else like to speak to that, or we have other questions as well?
I can briefly add to what Sean was saying in the context of the breeding programs. The investment that goes in breeding programs for modernizing the program so that the new varieties that are being developed for the farmers are taking care of a lot of things, including climate resilience and also the nutrition, biofortification. But at the same time, I think there's a realization that the modern breeding programs have also got limitations. I think you can see the investment shifting from one area of research to another just because there's not been much breakthrough that's coming as compared to green revolution when yields jumped because of the varieties and also the management practices. This has also grown interest in the policymakers, and we see it now very quite often talked about the potential of the crops that had not been potentially used by now, whether we should invest more in their research and mainstreaming. In that context, I see a huge investment in India. If you look at how the governments are investing in regenerative agriculture, natural farming, and bringing those land races back. And there's a debate between scientific communities and the civil organizations about the potential of the comparing the potential of the modern technology-driven varieties and the varieties that have been traditionally grown by the farmers. I think it's going to take time, but I think there's an element of policy also. As long as a policy alignment is there and this is properly invested, and it's going to be future for these crops, there's no doubt about it.
Thank you. Saeed, would you like to speak to this or make some closing comments either way?
I want to pick up something which probably we haven't covered, which I think is relevant, which is we talk about this of course, seed systems are part of this, and Manzoor was right. We've got to look at the whole holistic integration. I'm glad not just Emma's excellent webinar last week, but also Maria next week talking about agroecological approaches. But all of these are strategies towards a common goal. And one of the things which we really have to look at is how we make knowledge available to farmers. And that knowledge is not just, of course, their own knowledge, but what is the current state of the climate or the environment or the resources or the crops that they could use, the nutritional value, etc. And really, and I'm glad Chris is on this call as well, the idea of providing digital knowledge systems that are going to give the best information available on crop diversity, I think is really important in the hands of farmers, not in the hands of researchers purely. And we've developed a knowledge system called CropBase, but essentially what it's saying is there are in that database 2,000 crops, but of these 7,000 crops, how much information have we got, and how much can we make that available as rapidly and in the most trustworthy way as possible? And this is really where I think a role of digital innovations, even AI, can be brought together so that we can actually make this knowledge available rapidly so that farmers can make wise decisions based on the best available information. We can't expect farmers to make decisions on just their local circumstances and expect that to be transformative on a global scale unless we can connect that knowledge between farmers and exchange that information so it becomes available as quickly and I think all of us are working towards that. But it seems to me the priority should not be let's get even more information on the big crops. Let's really invest in the information on these minor crops so that we can actually move them up into that knowledge base that farmers and consumers and end users, scientists as well, can actually use. And I think that would be an important point.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Well, we are about at time with our webinar, though we have lots more discussion I'm sure we could all have. So I want to just thank Saeed, Sean, and Mansoor for joining us and providing their expertise today. We are putting the link in the chat to both download the report on which this session and all the sessions are based and to register for the next sessions if you're interested. Next week, Wednesday at the same time, whatever time that is for you, we'll have a presentation from Jessica Duncan from Wageningen University, who will be speaking about her chapter on food governance and power. So we hope you'll join us next week and or forthcoming weeks as we continue with the series. So thank you all very much. Thanks to everyone who has joined us and wishing you a wonderful rest of your day or evening. Take care.